The idea of obedience continues to be the holy grail of parenting. The idea that if we could just learn the right phrase, or hold on to the right attitude of authority, or bring in the right consequences, or sticker chart, or timeout protocol, our resistant children will magically bend their knees and start doing whatever we instruct. The pressure to pursue this path starts really early, like with newborn sleep training programs and shopkeepers expecting toddlers with only a few words in their vocabulary to say please and thank you. Many of us have just absorbed the idea from our own childhoods, from our mothers-in-law, from school, from 1980s sitcoms, that children just should obey us, and compliance is what defines our competence as parents. Good parent equals obedient child. Unfortunately, this assumption is not just an idea that floats around in our heads tormenting us. It's absolutely woven into the very fabric of our society. There are so many expectations on our children these days. They have to be a certain way most of the time, showing up places on time, dressed in a particular way, being quiet in most public places, sitting still a lot of the time, not touching things that they're surrounded by, not running at the pool, not climbing the statues, not shouting in the library, not putting things in their mouths or up their noses. And as parents, we are well aware that it is we who are expected to enforce these social rules, whether or not we personally agree with them. I'm going to look at 5 reasons why you might want to reconsider this myth of obedience. Reasons why pursuing obedience as a goal actually makes it much less likely that your child is going to do what you say, ironically. Our children are human, and human beings are pesky creatures who enjoy things like autonomy and choice and freedom. They enjoy knowing that their needs are being cared for. The uncomfortable truth that all parents come up against at one point or other is that even though society expects us to maintain obedience with our children haven't signed on to this social contract. What we actually mean by obedience, if you think about it, is getting a child to do something that they don't want to do. In fact, we celebrate the moral virtue of the idea that children should learn to do things they don't want to do. Just think about the language we use to describe children when they're not behaving in line with our social expectations. We call them willful, i.e. they have their own will, their own wants, needs, wishes. We call them rebellious, i.e. they're rebelling against the ideas or rules that they don't like, or don't agree with, or don't meet their values. We call them defiant, i.e. they're defying force that is used against them. We call them oppositional, i.e. they're opposing the rules and expectations that don't align with their wishes, their values, their needs. So what we're really wanting when we strive for obedience from our children is a child who will easily give up on their own wishes and wants in favour of ours. We're wanting them to lose their will, their spirit, their inner compass, and follow ours unquestioningly. What we do to a child when we put them in this position is we're giving them 2 options, either to give up or to fight back. If you have a child in the fight back category, you'll know about it pretty quickly. If they're in the give up category, the pain of this might not be evident until later in life. What tends to happen over time is that children who haven't experienced autonomy and choice in their childhoods then find it later in their teens or as adults by distancing themselves from their parents. Which brings us to the second point. Let's say we accept that obedience is our goal. How should we go about this? Obedience equals force. Humans have been experimenting with the idea of obedience for some time now. The only way we've really discovered to consistently and effectively make other people do what we want every time is through force. And what our extensive experiments of the past couple of millennia have showed us about this style of parenting is that this force needs to escalate over time in order to maintain obedience. And this is the weird bind we're in as modern parents. The tools of this obedience-based parenting have largely been removed from us because as a society we've decided that harming children is no longer something we have the stomach for, and thank goodness. Unfortunately, we haven't shaken the belief that children should always unquestioningly do what adults say. So parents and teachers are still expected to maintain Victorian levels of compliance, but using modern gentle techniques. This is why parents are largely ridiculed these days, because it's impossible. So what has crept in to replace the physical force that used to maintain obedience is more subtle forms of emotional force. Things like shouting, scaring our children, withdrawing love and affection. The pattern I see in the families I work with is that either families go deeper and deeper into scaring and forcing their children, leaving them feeling guilty and distressed, or they periodically give up shifting into permissiveness. This is why obedience, or authoritarian parenting, and permissiveness are actually two sides of the same coin. One creates the conditions for the other. Those who try to sustain obedience often end up giving up, for instance by having a really tightly controlled week and then a weekend where there's a free-for-all with screens. This is quite jarring and uncertain for children. Mindless compliance. A relationship based on obedience tends to lead to certain unforeseen and unintended consequences. If you've watched this far, I imagine you're a person who would actually quite like your child to be able to think for themselves, to develop careful moral reasoning, empathy, to be able to think critically, to be able to question the things that they hear and read and see. It doesn't take much imagination to think of some of the potential pitfalls of training a child to do anything an adult asks them to do unthinkingly. History is littered with the tragic and unforeseen consequences of this. By expecting obedience, we are expecting our child to relegate some of their thinking, to stop thinking for themselves, which makes it more likely that they will also not think well for themselves when they're at a party being offered drugs, or when they're in a relationship to do things they don't want to do, or go places they don't want to go, or believe things that they read or see that we would hope they might question. If we want children who are able to think for themselves, we need to give them opportunities to think and question and come up with their own inner compass. Harm to connection. We know from research that connection with our children is the most important thing for their development, for their mental health, for their learning, for their ability to form healthy, loving relationships as adults, for their brain development, and on and on. But it is really challenging to form this kind of deep connection when we're expecting obedience, because we introduce shame, guilt, conditional love. We sometimes oscillate between seeking closeness and affection and then forcing or shaming them. It's uncomfortable and confusing for them and for us, and it places a strain on this precious connection. The tragedy of this is that our children's evolutionary wiring actually programs them to follow the person they're attached to, literally, and also in terms of their choices, their decisions, their likes and dislikes. If you create distance in your relationship by forcing obedience, you're ironically making it less likely that they're going to want to do the things we ask. It's eroding our actual power, the evolutionary power of connection. We care about why they do things. There are all sorts of things that we want our children to do. We want them to do their homework, to give their brother a turn with the toy, to help out with the dishes, to get to school on time. But notice, very often we don't just want them to do these things mindlessly because we force them to. We actually want them to do it because they're learning some inner motivation to do it, that they can see the why. So we don't just want them to do their homework, we want them to grow into the kind of person that values learning. So yeah, sure, I can force or threaten or bribe my child to share their toys, but has this taught them to consider other humans, or has it taught them that force is a really good way to get what you want? The uncomfortable and research-based truth about this is children don't learn kindness, compassion, consideration, respect, independence, responsibility, and care by being forced to obey our rules. They develop these capacities slowly and gradually over time in the context of loving, caring relationships. If we have an expectation of obedience, the whole way we relate to our children ironically makes it less likely that they'll cooperate with us. Once we give up on pursuing obedience as our goal, we can actually start to relate to our children in ways that make it much more likely that they're going to want to do these things, that they actually have the developmental capacity to be cooperative, empathetic, kind, considerate, and so on. If you're hearing all of this and worrying a little bit, what can you do without this myth of obedience? I want you to rest assured there are actually many things we can do as parents to make it more likely that our children will be willing to hear us, to want to cooperate with us, to want to do what we say, which is nice. It makes life a whole lot easier. And if you want to know in detail how to do that, I've made a video here that you can watch.